Dre was 9 years old the first time he learned that the world ran on two sets of rules. The ones printed in his school books, and the ones that actually decided who ate that night and who didn't. His father had been gone 3 years by then. Not dead, just gone. Swallowed whole by a system that took men off the block and gave back nothing but court dates and silence. His mother worked 2 jobs and came home most nights smelling like bleach and exhaustion, too tired to do anything but sleep before the next shift. Some months, there wasn't enough for both rent and groceries. Rent always won. Dre learned to be quiet about being hungry. Nobody recruited him. The street just noticed him. The kid who was always outside, always watching, always a little too alert for a 9-year-old. One afternoon, a teenager everyone called Reese pressed a folded $20 bill into his hand and gave him one job. If a certain car rolled by slow, whistle twice. Dre didn't think of it as a beginning. He thought of it as dinner. The lookout. For the next year, that corner was Dre's entire world. He learned to read a block the way other kids learn to read books. Which cars idled wrong, which adults you nodded to, which ones you quietly became invisible around. Nobody called it a job, but it had hours and rules and, though Dre wouldn't have had the word for it, a hierarchy. Without ever choosing to, he'd taken his first step onto the bottom rung of something much bigger than the block. The runner. By 12, Dre had moved up, which mostly meant carrying things instead of just watching for them. Small packages, folded into a waistband, passed from one hand to another along routes only he and a handful of others knew. He learned, fast, not to ask what was inside. What he learned instead was the invisible map underneath the real one. Which alleys connected to which streets, which buildings had back doors that led nowhere good if you were the one being chased. He also learned, that same year, what happened to runners who got curious, or careless, or greedy. He didn't see it happen. He just stopped seeing a kid named Marcus, and nobody ever explained, and Dre understood that some questions you only get to ask once. The corner. At 15, Dre started selling. His own corner, his own regulars, a small rhythm of nods and exchanges that looked, to anyone driving past, like nothing at all. For the first time, there was real money in his pocket. Enough that he started slipping cash into his mother's purse and telling her it was from a job bagging groceries. She wanted to believe him, so she did, and neither of them said much else about it. That same year, Dre saw up close, for the first time, what the whole arrangement was built to enforce. A disagreement over a few $100s ended with a boy he'd known since elementary school simply never coming back to the block. Dre went to the funeral in the only black shirt he owned. The next morning, he was back on his corner, not because he wanted to be, but because falling back, looking soft, looking like an easy target, felt like the more dangerous choice. Running his own. By 18, Dre wasn't just selling anymore. He had 3 or 4 younger kids working under him, each one running their own version of the job he'd started with. One slow afternoon, he caught himself doing exactly what Reese had once done to him, pressing a folded bill into some hungry kid's hand on a stoop in exchange for a whistle. He didn't think about it for long. There wasn't room to. The money was serious now. Serious enough that, on paper, Dre could have walked away. But by then, he had people depending on him, rivals watching him, and a name that meant something on streets he'd never even been to. All three of those things made leaving harder, not easier. The life had stopped being something that was happening to him. It had become the only shape he knew how to be. Expansion. His 20s moved fast. What had been a corner became a network. First across his side of the city, then into neighborhoods he'd never set foot in, connected by people he'd never met and would never fully trust. Money stopped being something he counted by hand and became something he moved, hid, and laundered through small businesses that existed mostly as names on paperwork. Somewhere in there, his mother found out. Not from him, from a local news segment about a string of arrests 2 rungs below him, a segment that used a nickname she recognized instantly. She didn't yell. She simply stopped answering his calls. Dre told himself it was to protect her. Underneath that, he knew it was because she couldn't look at what he'd become without seeing exactly where it had started. With a hungry 9-year-old and $20 she'd never known about. The top. By his 30s, Dre's name carried weight in rooms he never personally entered. Product moved across state lines under his direction, sometimes across borders, a web of drivers, storage units, shell companies, and careful silence that stretched further than he could fully picture, run by people he'd promoted the same way he himself had been promoted. For loyalty, for discretion, for the simple absence of better options. He had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes. He also hadn't slept through a full night in years. Every person close enough to be trusted was also close enough to end him. One bad arrest, one moment of fear, one decision to talk, and everything could come apart. The higher he climbed, the fewer rooms existed where he could actually breathe. He lived now behind layers most people only ever see in movies. Drivers, security, houses owned through names that weren't his. Not because he wanted that life, but because he could no longer survive without it. The empire he'd built to finally feel safe had quietly become the single most dangerous place he could possibly be. The window. Late one night, one of the many he spent awake, Dre stood at a reinforced window in a house that technically belonged to 4 different people who weren't him, looking out over a skyline that, in small and indirect ways, moved because of decisions he made in rooms with the blinds drawn. Somewhere out there was the old block, the stoop, the corner where a folded 20 had once felt like the entire world. He thought about the kid he used to be, the one who hadn't wanted power or territory or a name that meant something on streets he'd never visit. That kid had wanted exactly one thing: to feel safe. Dre had more control now than that kid could ever have imagined, and in his entire life, he had never felt less safe than he did at that moment, surrounded by men whose loyalty he could never fully verify, in a house with 7 exits he'd memorized and knew somehow he'd still never reach in time. Somewhere else in the city, his mother was getting ready for bed in an apartment he'd paid for anonymously, through a lawyer she'd never met, the only kind of help she'd still accept from a son she no longer recognized. Dre had climbed every rung there was. He held more than most people could ever picture: roots, money, the quiet edges of other people's lives, scattered across a map almost no one would ever see. What he didn't have, what no rank above this one could buy back, was a single room, anywhere in the world, where he could close his eyes without listening for footsteps. The kid on the stoop had only ever wanted to feel safe. The man at the top had built an empire and lost the one thing he'd been chasing since he was 9 years old.